There is equipment sitting on the surface of the moon right now: landing struts, descent stages, instrument panels. And stamped into the metal are the words, "Made in Bethpage, New York." Bethpage is a hamlet on Long Island about 35 miles east of Manhattan, and in the 1960s it was the nerve center of one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. The Grumman Aircraft plant there employed over 20,000 people at its peak, building the machine that would carry Neil Armstrong down to the Sea of Tranquility. That factory complex once covered 600 acres. Today it covers 9. Most of the old site is a Superfund cleanup zone, the groundwater beneath it laced with industrial solvents that have been spreading through Long Island's sole source aquifer for decades. The moon still has the hardware. Bethpage has the contamination. That contrast between what Long Island built and what Long Island became is the whole story of the place, compressed into a single fact. For a century and a half, Long Island was the stage on which Americans acted out their most extravagant fantasies about wealth, space, mobility, and the good life. The richest men in the country built castles on its north shore. The most celebrated aviator on earth launched himself toward Paris from its central plains. The most influential suburban developer in American history paved over its potato fields and created a template that every Sunbelt subdivision would copy for the next 70 years. The island built warplanes that helped win a world war, then built the spacecraft that won the space race. And then, slowly, without any single catastrophe or dramatic turning point, the whole arrangement began to seize up, locked in place by the very decisions that had once made it great. It's a story about what happens when the most successful experiment in middle-class prosperity runs out of room to grow. Start with the land itself, because the land is what made all of it possible. Long Island stretches 118 miles east from the edge of New York City into the Atlantic, shaped roughly like a fish, and its western half contains something that once existed nowhere else east of the Allegheny Mountains: a natural grassland prairie. The Hempstead Plains covered 60,000 acres of central Nassau County, flat, treeless, windswept, the kind of terrain you'd expect in Kansas, not 20 miles from Manhattan. The Lenape people had managed these grasslands for centuries, burning them to maintain the open landscape for hunting. English colonists used them to graze livestock. And for nearly 250 years after European settlement, the plains just sat there, too flat and too exposed for anyone to consider particularly valuable. That would change. In 1869, a man named Alexander Turney Stewart looked at those empty grasslands and saw something nobody else did. Stewart was an Irish immigrant who had arrived in New York in 1818 with almost nothing and proceeded to invent the modern department store. By the late 1860s, he was widely considered the wealthiest man in America, richer by some estimates than Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was 66 years old, childless, and thinking about legacy. What he wanted to build was not a store or a factory, but a town. He purchased 7,000 acres of the Hempstead Plains for roughly $394,000, about $55 an acre, and announced plans for a planned community called Garden City. Wide, tree-lined avenues, spacious lots, handsome homes, a cathedral, a hotel, even his own railroad line, the Central Railroad of Long Island, to connect the new town to Manhattan. Stewart was building a suburb before the word meant what it means today. He was also, in a sense, writing the opening chapter of Long Island's entire modern history. A rich man looks at empty land near New York City and decides to turn it into something. Stewart died in 1876 before his vision was fully realized. But his wife Cornelia finished the job, building the Cathedral of the Incarnation in his memory, a soaring English Gothic structure that became the seat of the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island, along with St. Paul's School, whose Ruskinian Gothic main building stretched 300 feet across and contained 500 rooms. Garden City's architectural standards were enforced with religious conviction, and they have been enforced continuously for over 150 years. The village never allowed subdivision or character drift. That fact alone would distinguish it from nearly every other community in America. But Garden City was a prelude. The real spectacle was already gathering on the North Shore. Starting in the 1890s and accelerating through the 1920s, the wealthiest families in America began constructing country estates along the bluffs and harbors overlooking Long Island Sound, in towns with names like Oyster Bay, Glen Cove, Cold Spring Harbor, Old Westbury. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Morgans, the Guggenheims, the Phipps family, heirs to the Carnegie Steel fortune, the Woolworths. By some counts, more than 1,000 of these estates were built in a stretch that became known as the Gold Coast, a phrase coined not by historians, but by the people who lived there. These were not houses. They were declarations of conquest, built in every architectural style imaginable: Tudor, Georgian, French Renaissance, Spanish Revival. The builders raided the great homes of Europe for materials. Stonework, mantels, entire rooms were dismantled, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled on Long Island hilltops. The most extraordinary of all these estates belonged to a man whose story captures the Gold Coast's particular brand of American ambition. Otto Hermann Kahn was born in Mannheim, Germany in 1867, the son of a Jewish family. He arrived in the United States in 1893 and joined the investment bank Kuhn, Loeb and Company, where he helped reorganize the Union Pacific Railroad alongside E.H. Harriman. By the early 1900s, Kahn was one of the most powerful financiers on Wall Street. He was also, by temperament and inclination, a man who craved acceptance from a Protestant upper class that largely excluded Jews, no matter how wealthy. His response was to build something that could not be ignored. In 1914, Kahn purchased 443 acres on the highest point of Long Island, near Cold Spring Harbor. Before any construction could begin, he spent 2 full years having workers build up the hilltop itself, moving thousands of tons of earth to raise the elevation even further. He then commissioned the architects Delano and Aldrich, the Gold Coast's most prestigious firm, along with the Olmsted brothers, whose father had designed Central Park, to create the grounds. The result was Oheka Castle. The name was an acronym: Otto Hermann Kahn. The estate, completed in 1919, was 109,000 square feet, contained 127 rooms, 39 fireplaces, and a grand staircase modeled on the Chateau de Fontainebleau. The total cost was $11 million, roughly $160 million in today's money. A staff of 126 full-time servants maintained it. It was the second largest private residence ever built in America, surpassed only by Biltmore in North Carolina. During the 1920s, Kahn used Oheka as his summer residence, throwing parties that drew diplomats, heads of state, and Hollywood royalty. Charlie Chaplin was a personal friend. A room at Oheka was eventually dedicated to him, its walls covered with photographs of the two men together, often alongside Douglas Fairbanks. Kahn was also the primary patron of the Metropolitan Opera, pouring millions into the company and shaping its repertoire for decades. He was, in every measurable sense, one of the most cultivated and generous men in New York. He was also, to much of the Protestant establishment, still a Jewish outsider. Oheka was his answer, not a plea for acceptance, but a monument that made acceptance irrelevant. It was almost certainly these parties, this estate, this stretch of the North Shore, that gave F. Scott Fitzgerald the raw material for The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, a novel about a man who builds a monument to his own longing on the shores of Long Island Sound. Fitzgerald lived in Great Neck, just down the coast, and could see the green dock lights of estates like Kahn's from across the water. When Orson Welles created Xanadu for Citizen Kane in 1941, the fictional palace was modeled on Oheka. Gatsby's mansion was fiction. The world it described was not. But even as the Gold Coast blittered, the Hempstead Plains were producing something that would eventually matter far more than any mansion. That flat, treeless prairie turned out to be a perfect natural airfield, the only one of its kind on the eastern seaboard, right next to America's largest city and at the western edge of the Atlantic Ocean. By the early 1900s, aviators were flocking to the plains. Curtis Field, Mitchell Field, and Roosevelt Field all clustered in the same stretch of central Nassau County. It was from Roosevelt Field at 7:52 on the rainy morning of May 20th, 1927, that a 25-year-old airmail pilot named Charles Lindbergh opened the throttle of the Spirit of St. Louis, a monoplane so loaded with fuel it barely cleared the telephone wires at the end of the runway, and headed northeast over the Atlantic toward Paris. 33.5 hours later, he landed at Le Bourget Aerodrome, and the modern age of aviation effectively began. The field he left behind would close in 1951. Today, it is a shopping mall, Roosevelt Field Mall. The spot where Lindbergh's wheels left the ground is somewhere between the food court and a department store anchor. 2 years after Lindbergh's flight, on December 6, 1929, barely 6 weeks after the stock market crash, a man named Leroy Grumman and 3 partners pooled their savings and founded the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in a rented garage in Baldwin, Long Island. Grumman was a former employee of the Loaning Aircraft Company, who had stayed behind when the firm relocated to Pennsylvania. He was quiet, precise, and obsessed with engineering. Within a few years, his little company won its first Navy contract, a 2-seat biplane with retractable landing gear, the first of its kind in military aviation. The company moved from Baldwin to Valley Stream in 1931, then to Farmingdale in 1932, and finally to Bethpage in 1937, where it would remain for the next half-century. Grumman wasn't the only aircraft manufacturer on the island. Republic Aviation, founded as the Seversky Aircraft Company in 1931, operated out of Farmingdale. But Grumman was the one that would come to define Long Island itself. Meanwhile, a man who was neither a financier nor an aviator was reshaping the island more profoundly than either. Robert Moses was a Yale and Oxford-educated political operator who had attached himself to Governor Al Smith in the 1920s and leveraged that relationship into an astonishing accumulation of power. In 1924, Moses became president of the Long Island State Park Commission, and he immediately began pushing for something that the Gold Coast aristocrats viewed as an existential threat: public parkways cutting through or near their estates, connecting New York City to the beaches of Long Island's South Shore. The wealthy landowners fought him viciously. Moses called them the most snobbish and reactionary community in the United States, and built the parkways anyway. Jones Beach State Park opened in 1929, and it was unlike any public beach Americans had ever seen. Moses built it as a monument: bathhouses with Art Deco details, a Campanile water tower modeled on a Venetian bell tower, parking lots engineered for thousands of automobiles. 350,000 people visited in its first month alone. But Moses built the infrastructure to serve a very particular vision of who should visit. The Southern State Parkway, which led to Jones Beach, was constructed with bridge overpasses deliberately set at about 9 feet, just low enough to prevent city buses, which typically stood at 9 feet 11 inches, from passing beneath them. The people who rode city buses were disproportionately poor and black. Moses never had to post a sign. He poured his exclusion into the concrete itself, and the bridges are still standing. What Moses did more than anything was make the automobile the organizing principle of Long Island life. His parkways, the Northern State, the Southern State, the Wantagh, the Meadowbrook, carved the island into corridors of movement designed exclusively for cars. He also blocked the Long Island Railroad from building a line to Jones Beach, ensuring that access to the island's greatest public amenity required private transportation. The Long Island Railroad, chartered in 1834, and the oldest railroad in America still operating under its original name, had been in financial trouble for almost as long as it had existed. The LIRR was originally conceived not as a commuter line, but as a through route. The idea was to move passengers and freight across the length of Long Island to a steamboat connection that would complete the journey to Boston faster than overland routes. That plan failed almost immediately, but the railroad survived by reinventing itself as a carrier for the farms, resort towns, and eventually the commuter villages that grew up along its branches. By the 1940s, the LIRR was hemorrhaging money under the ownership of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which had bought it in 1900 for $6 million as part of the grand plan to build Penn Station. The wealthy PRR had subsidized its unprofitable subsidiary for decades, but the New York Public Service Commission had forbidden the LIRR from raising commuter fares for nearly 3 decades, from 1918 to 1947, even as the railroad's own taxes tripled, from $1.4 million in 1921 to $3.8 million by 1948. In 1949, the railroad declared bankruptcy. It was and remains the busiest commuter railroad in North America, an essential artery serving hundreds of thousands of daily riders across more than 700 miles of track. But for most of its history, it has been either bankrupt, subsidized, or both. The state of New York eventually purchased it in 1966 for $65 million. Now the stage was set. The Gold Coast gave Long Island its mystique. Aviation gave it its identity as the edge of the possible. Moses gave it its highways. The railroad, even in its battered condition, gave it a commuter link to Manhattan. All that was needed was the people. And in 1947, they arrived. William Levitt had grown up watching his father Abraham build custom homes for upper-middle-class buyers on Long Island. During the war, the Levitt family firm won a government contract to build 1,600 houses for workers at a Norfolk, Virginia shipyard, and William came back from that experience with an insight that would alter American life. He realized that home construction could be industrialized. Instead of building one house at a time, you could divide the process into 27 discrete steps, train 27 specialized teams, and move them across the landscape like an assembly line laid flat. The family firm, Levitt & Sons, purchased 4,000 acres of potato fields in the Island Trees section of Nassau County, about 30 miles east of Manhattan. The land had been growing potatoes. By the 1940s, 80% of all farming on Long Island was dedicated to potatoes, and Levitt was about to turn it into something else entirely. Construction began in 1947. The operation looked less like home building and more like a military campaign. Trucks delivered pre-cut lumber to each lot at precise intervals. One crew poured foundations, another framed walls, another installed plumbing. 27 teams, 27 steps, rolling across the former potato fields in perfect sequence. A house could be completed every 16 minutes. The workers were paid well, better than union scale, in fact, but Levitt refused to hire union contractors, and picket lines materialized at the edges of the site. He didn't care. Each finished house was a 4-room Cape Cod with an expansion attic, a modern kitchen with built-in appliances, and a television set, priced initially at around $8,000, which GI Bill financing could reduce to a down payment of as little as $400. Levitt renamed the development Levittown. By 1951, the firm had built 17,447 homes across 7 square miles. On a single day, Levitt & Sons sold 650 of them in 5 hours. Families drove out to the site, picked a lot in about 5 minutes, and signed their paperwork before lunch. It took a couple longer to choose a restaurant for dinner than it took them to choose their house. Fortune magazine noted in 1947 that it was a poor week when Levitt houses aren't featured in at least one full-column story in the New York newspapers. In 1951, Collier's magazine photographed Levittown from the top of its 200-foot water tower using 1,500 flash bulbs in what was billed as the biggest flash photograph ever attempted. William Levitt himself cultivated a showman's persona, part builder, part carnival barker, and he understood, with P.T. Barnum instincts, that the spectacle of Levittown was as important as the product. Levittown became the most famous suburb in the world, and its fame was not undeserved. It was cheap, clean, and new, at a moment when millions of young families were living in converted barracks, doubled up with relatives, or, in documented cases, sheltering in chicken coops and old ice boxes. The GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration made mortgages astonishingly cheap. Long Island farmland was going for almost nothing. The 1948 Housing Bill liberalized lending further, allowing anyone to buy a home with 5% down and extending mortgage terms to 30 years. Everything pointed in one direction, east, out of the city, into the open country of Nassau and Suffolk. The numbers are staggering. Nassau County's population hit 55,500 in 1900. By 1930, after the first waves of commuter development, it was over 300,000. Then came the suburban explosion. From 1950 to 1960, Nassau's population grew by 93%. Suffolk County, farther east and still largely rural, saw its population jump from 272,000 in 1950 to 667,000 in 1960, an increase of 145% in a single decade. By 1970, the combined population of Nassau and Suffolk had more than doubled since 1950, adding over 1.6 million people. The wave of bodies, houses, schools, and shopping centers rolled eastward across the island like a tide that never went out. And through all of it, Grumman kept building. During the Second World War, the company's workforce surged from about 700 in 1939 to over 25,000 by 1943, and Long Island's aviation plants were producing more than 600 military aircraft a month. Grumman's Hellcat and Avenger fighters helped win the air war in the Pacific. After the war, the company moved into jet fighters, the Panther, the Tiger, the Intruder, and its planes saw combat in Korea and Vietnam. Republic Aviation, down the road in Farmingdale, built the massive F-105 Thunder Chief. For 2 decades, Long Island was one of the most important centers of military aircraft production in the world. Then, in 1962, Grumman won a contract that elevated the company, and Bethpage, from important to historic. NASA selected Grumman from among 11 bidders to build the lunar excursion module for the Apollo program. The contract was worth $387.9 million. It was the first and remains the only vehicle ever designed to carry human beings from one world to another. At the peak of the space program, Grumman employed roughly 10,000 people on the lunar module project alone. Early development models were mocked up with wood and paper clips. The final product was an engineering marvel of controlled fragility, so light that a misplaced elbow could puncture the hull, yet precise enough to land on the moon with a margin of error measured in seconds of fuel. 13 lunar modules were built. Equipment stamped with the address of a hamlet on Long Island now sits on the surface of another celestial body, 240,000 miles away. No suburb in the history of the world has a claim like that. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Long Island hit its peak. Nassau County was consistently ranked among the wealthiest counties in the United States. Grumman's workforce climbed past 20,000, eventually reaching over 34,000 by 1988, making it the largest private employer on the island. The F-14 Tomcat, widely considered the finest Navy fighter ever built, was developed and produced at Grumman's facilities. Its first flight took place on December 21, 1970, at Grumman's Calverton plant in eastern Suffolk County. At its height, the F-14 was a $50 million aircraft, and the Tomcat contract was the pillar that held up the company. The company contributed up to $16 million a year in school property taxes to the Bethpage district alone. Grumman donated to the local Rotary Club, gave out turkeys at Christmas, sponsored community picnics. The roar of jet engine tests on Saturday mornings was a familiar sound in Bethpage, a minor annoyance, easily tolerated when the company was paying for schools and putting food on every other table in town. One longtime Long Island resident put it simply: every family on the island had somebody who worked for Grumman. But the structure that looked so solid had a crack in it, and the crack was the same one that had run through Long Island's story from the beginning. Every golden age on the island was built on a single foundation, and when that foundation shifted, everything above it shifted too. The Gold Coast depended on an economic order that the income tax and the Depression would undermine. Aviation depended on military contracts that the end of the Cold War would evaporate. And the suburbs, the whole magnificent post-war experiment, depended on cheap land, population growth, and federal subsidy, all three of which eventually ran out. The Cold War ended, and the Pentagon's budgets contracted. Republic Aviation was already gone by the late 1980s, absorbed into Fairchild, and then shut down. Grumman's situation grew dire. The F-14 line wound down. The E-2C Hawkeye, an early warning plane, became the last aircraft manufactured at the massive 1.5 million square foot Calverton plant. In 1981, when the Dallas-based LTV Corporation attempted a hostile takeover of Grumman, something remarkable happened. The people of Bethpage rallied to the company's defense. Shop owners on Broadway and Stewart Avenue put up signs in their windows. Residents wore Save Grumman T-shirts. The takeover was beaten back. The community had saved its employer. 13 years later, there was nothing to save. On April 4, 1994, Grumman merged with Northrop Corporation to form Northrop Grumman, and the headquarters moved to Falls Church, Virginia. The 600-acre Bethpage complex was gradually reduced to 9 acres. The workforce shrank from over 20,000 to 500. The $16 million a year in school property taxes vanished. A 76-year-old Bethpage resident, Sandra D'Arcangelo, who had lived in the hamlet for 4 decades, would later put the community's bewilderment into words that carried a particular sting. It's hard for people to understand you could put a man on the moon, you can do all these things in space, and we're totally ineffective when it comes to cleaning up the contamination we made here on Earth. The Saturday morning roar of jet engines went silent, and the silence turned out to be far more disturbing than the noise had ever been. The departure of the defense industry exposed a problem that had been building for decades. Long Island had built itself out. Nassau County was, by the 1970s, almost entirely developed. There was essentially no vacant land left for new construction. Only about 1% of all housing value in Nassau was built after 2023, a figure that astonishes people who hear it. The housing stock was aging, the infrastructure was aging, but the tax burden was not aging, it was growing. New York's property tax system, particularly as it applied to Long Island's 127 school districts and dozens of overlapping municipal jurisdictions, created a structure in which costs rose relentlessly while the tax base remained fixed. You could not build new commercial properties to broaden the base because the land was taken. You could not annex territory because the island is an island. You could not merge school districts because each one was fiercely defended by the community it served. So taxes went up and up and up. Nassau County today has some of the highest property taxes in the United States. The average tax bill approaches $20,000 a year. A retired AT&T manager in Port Washington watched his property taxes climb from $3,000 when he bought his house in 1975 to nearly $16,000 on a fixed pension. A home in an affluent North Shore village might carry a $40,000 annual tax bill. The median home price in Nassau County has reached approximately $900,000, nearly double the national median. It is simultaneously one of the most expensive counties to buy into and one of the most expensive to remain in. The result is a peculiar kind of paralysis. The people who own homes are sitting on enormous equity, but many of them, particularly retirees on fixed incomes, can barely afford to stay. The young people, meanwhile, have been leaving. The numbers tell the story with uncomfortable clarity. Over 70% of Long Islanders aged 18 to 35 have indicated in surveys that they are likely to leave in the next 5 years, citing housing costs and property taxes as the primary reasons. The young adult population has dropped by over 50% in some of the island's wealthiest communities, 58% in Kings Point, 51% in Oyster Bay. In 1970, fewer than 10% of Long Islanders aged 25 to 34 lived with their parents. By 2016, that figure had risen to over 44%, nearly 4 times the national average. The children of the baby boomers, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the families who moved into those Cape Cods and ranch houses in the 1950s, cannot afford to buy those same houses at current prices, in a market where rents for a basic 2-bedroom apartment start at $3,000 a month. The irony would be poetic if it weren't so consequential. Long Island was built as the solution to a housing crisis, the post-war shortage that had families doubling up and living in converted garages. William Levitt's genius was making home ownership accessible to ordinary people. Now the place he built is itself a housing crisis. The houses are there, the streets are there, the schools, which are among the best in the state, are there. But the structure that was supposed to deliver the American dream has become a machine that prices out anyone who hasn't already arrived. Nassau County's fiscal situation came to a head in 2011 when the county came within days of losing control of its finances to a state-appointed board, the Nassau County Interim Finance Authority. The wealthiest suburb in New York State was on the brink of the same kind of receivership that usually befell struggling cities upstate. The county's comptroller at the time observed what everyone already knew. Nassau County was one of the highest taxed counties in the country, and the taxes were driving people away. New York leads the nation in outmigration, and more than half of the departing taxpayers are married couples earning between $100,000 and $500,000. Precisely the demographic that Long Island was built to attract and retain. There is a tendency when telling stories like this to identify a villain, Robert Moses, or the Levitt's racial covenants, or the Pentagon's procurement decisions, or the overlapping school districts that nobody will consolidate. And each of those things is a real part of the story. Levittown's original leases explicitly prohibited sale or rental to black families, a policy that was legal at the time and whose effects are still measurable in Long Island's demographic geography. Moses's low bridges were an act of design as discrimination that no subsequent administration has reversed. The school district fragmentation is genuinely dysfunctional. But the deeper story is not about any single decision. It is about a model, the post-war suburban model, that was designed for a specific set of conditions: abundant, cheap land, rapid population growth, heavy federal investment, and a manufacturing economy that provided middle-class wages without requiring a college degree. Every one of those conditions has changed. The land is gone. The population growth has stalled. The combined population of Nassau and Suffolk grew by fewer than 300,000 in the 40 years after 1970, compared to 1.6 million in the 20 years before. The federal investment has shifted elsewhere, and the manufacturing economy, Grumman, Republic, the defense contractors, the factories, has been replaced by a service economy that pays well at the top and poorly at the bottom, with less and less in between. And yet, the physical structure of the place remains locked in its 1960s configuration. The houses are still single-family, mostly on quarter-acre lots. The roads are still built for cars. The zoning still prohibits in most communities the kind of multifamily housing that might make the island affordable to younger families. The school districts are still tiny and independent. The property taxes are still levied on a base that hasn't grown. Long Island did not decline the way a factory town declines, with shuttered storefronts and vacant lots. It declined the way a prosperous family declines when the fortune is tied up in a house that costs more to maintain than the income it generates. Everything looks fine from the outside. The lawns are still mowed. The schools still produce national merit scholars. The median household income in Nassau County is still over $125,000, which makes it one of the richest counties in New York and, by some measures, in the country. But the machinery underneath, the fiscal machinery, the demographic machinery, the housing machinery, is straining in ways that the surface does not reveal. The Hempstead Plains, the 60,000-acre grassland prairie that started everything, that drew Alexander Stewart, that hosted Charles Lindbergh, that became Levittown, that became the most built-out suburban landscape in America, has been reduced to 19 acres. 19 acres of protected remnant grassland in a nature preserve in the town of Hempstead, the last surviving fragment of the only natural prairie that ever existed east of the Alleghenies. It is maintained by volunteers and visited mostly by bird watchers. Few of the people who drive past it on their way to the Roosevelt Field Mall, on the ground where Lindbergh took off, know that it is there, or what it once was, or what was lost when the last of it was plowed under or paved over. Otto Kahn's Oheka Castle still stands on the highest point on Long Island. After Kahn died in 1934, the estate passed through a series of increasingly undignified incarnations: a retreat for New York City sanitation workers, a government training school for merchant marine radio operators, and finally, the Eastern Military Academy, which bought it in 1948, bulldozed the gardens, subdivided the 127 rooms, and painted over the walls. The castle was gutted by fire, vandalized, left for dead. In the 1980s, a local developer named Gary Melius purchased the derelict property and spent decades and millions of dollars restoring it, room by room, to something approaching its original grandeur. Today, it operates as a luxury hotel and wedding venue. A night in the castle costs more than a month's mortgage payment on one of the original Levittown Cape Cods. The restoration is genuine, meticulous, and, in its way, moving. But the world that Kahn built it for is gone. The last F-14 Tomcat to fly on Long Island landed at the former Republic Aviation Airfield. It is now a static display piece in Bethpage. The Cradle of Aviation Museum in Garden City sits on land that was once part of Mitchell Field, which was once part of the Hempstead Plains. Inside, you can see a Grumman lunar module, one of the few surviving examples of the machine that carried human beings to the moon. Outside, the parking lot is full of cars belonging to shoppers at the adjacent mall. At 7:52 on a rainy morning in 1927, a young man in a small airplane lifted off from a grass runway on the Hempstead Plains, so overloaded with fuel he barely cleared the wires, and flew toward something that had never been done before. The runway is a parking lot now. The plains are a mall and a museum and a 19-acre nature preserve. The castles of the Gold Coast are hotels and event spaces. The potato fields are subdivisions whose owners cannot afford their own property taxes. The factory that put human footprints on the moon is 9 acres and 500 workers and a plume of trichloroethylene spreading through the groundwater. The island is still there. The houses, the schools, the beaches, the parkways, the railroad, all still there, all still functioning, all still expensive. On a spring evening, if you stand at the right spot on the North Shore and look out across Long Island Sound, you can still see what Fitzgerald saw: the green lights on the far docks, the dark water, the sense of something vast and luminous just out of reach.